The air in the mountains of coastal Oregon has a weight to it. It's heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a primordial perfume that clings to your clothes and settles in your lungs. It's a place that feels ancient, a place where the towering Douglas firs seem to whisper secrets just beyond the range of human hearing. For the people in the small, forgotten town of Havenwood, the sanctuary of the White Cloud was a beacon on the hill, a place of peace, a place of charity, a place run by a benevolent abbot who seemed to embody the very serenity the landscape promised. But on the 10th of July 2008, the illusion of peace was about to be violently, irrevocably shattered. It started with the smell. 4 teenagers, bored on a summer morning, had decided to cut through the woods behind the sanctuary, looking for a secluded spot to drink the cheap beer they'd bought with a fake ID. The path was overgrown, but the destination was a small clearing they called their own. But that morning, something was wrong. The usual scent of pine was suffocated by something else, a sweet, cloying stench of rot, the kind of smell that coats the back of your throat and makes your stomach turn. It was the smell of death, concentrated and corrupting. They followed it, their morbid curiosity overpowering their disgust. It led them to a patch of earth that was wrong, lumpy, uneven, as if the ground itself were suffering from some terrible swollen disease. Flies, fat and iridescent green, buzzed in a thick, lazy cloud over the spot. One of the boys, braver or stupider than the rest, nudged the loose soil with the toe of his boot. He suspected a dead deer, maybe a bear. He dug a little deeper with a stick, his friends groaning in disgust, and then he saw it, clawing its way out of the shallow grave. A human arm. The flesh was charred, blackened and decomposing, but the shape was unmistakable. A hand, its fingers curled into a silent, desperate claw. The scream that tore from the boy's throat was shrill and animalistic, a sound that sent the birds scattering from the ancient trees. They ran, tumbling over each other in a blind panic, leaving the scent and the horror behind them. Within the hour, the woods were no longer silent. They were filled with the crackle of police radios and the grim, determined footsteps of men who were paid to look into the abyss. The area was sealed off with bright yellow tape, a stark, artificial violation of the natural green and brown. Detective Miles Corrigan of the county sheriff's office stood at the edge of the scene, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. He was a man built of sharp angles and quiet observation, his face a roadmap of too many long nights and too many grim discoveries. He looked at the large, disturbed area of Earth, much larger than would be needed for a single body. A cold certainty settled in his gut. This wasn't one grave. This was a dumping ground. He gave the nod to the forensic team. They began to excavate, their movements careful and practiced. As they scraped away the first layers of soil and dead leaves, the putrid smell intensified, becoming a physical presence, a suffocating wave of decay. They found fragments of cloth first, a rough brown fabric. Miles knelt, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. He picked up a piece. It felt coarse, utilitarian. One of the younger deputies, his face pale and beaded with sweat, recognized it. It looked like a monk's robe, or a nun's. Then the bodies began to emerge, not whole but in pieces. A leg here, a torso there, a tangled mat of dark hair fused to a decomposing skull. The varying states of decay were immediately apparent. Some were skeletal, picked clean by the earth and its creatures. Others were more recent, their flesh a grotesque landscape of putrefaction. It was a layered cake of death. By the end of the first day, they had unearthed the remains of at least 6 females. By 10 o'clock the next morning, the final horrific tally was confirmed. 13 bodies, all female, all estimated to be between 20 and 30 years old, and all of them, in one way or another, were wrapped or dressed in that same brown fabric of a monastic robe. The evidence was irrefutable. A mass grave of nuns lay rotting just a stone's throw from the tranquil walls of the sanctuary of the White Cloud. The sanctuary was a paradox. To the villagers of Havenwood, it was a source of pride. The abbot, a man they knew as Abbot Thomas, was revered. He was a thin man in his late 50s, with a gentle voice and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, compassionate wisdom. He organized food drives for the poor. He offered shelter to the troubled. He had built this place from nothing, a refuge of Eastern philosophy blended with Western self-help, a perfect spiritual cocktail for the lost souls of modern America. The image of this peaceful, charitable sanctuary now clashed violently with the macabre reality of the charnel pit just beyond its back gate. Miles Corrigan's investigation naturally, immediately focused on the temple. On the 11th of July, he and his partner walked up the stone steps, past the wind chimes that tinkled a gentle, mocking melody in the breeze. Abbot Thomas met them at the door. He was the picture of calm cooperation. His thin frame was draped in a clean, pressed brown robe. He expressed shock and horror at the news, his face a mask of sorrowful disbelief. He offered them tea. "This is a terrible tragedy, detective," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Those poor souls." Miles sat across from him in a simple Spartan room that smelled of sandalwood incense. The scent fought a losing battle with the faint, lingering odor of decay that clung to Miles's own clothes. "Abbot," Miles began, "we have reason to believe the victims were nuns, perhaps from this sanctuary." The abbot shook his head slowly, a gesture of deep sadness. "That is difficult to comprehend. We have only a few permanent residents here, detective. Many young women come for short-term practice. They seek solace, guidance. They stay for a few weeks, a few months, and then they move on. The path of enlightenment is different for everyone. It is difficult to keep track of their movements once they decide to leave." "You keep a register, a logbook?" "Of course," the abbot said, and he produced a simple ledger. He slid it across the wooden table. Miles opened it. It was incomplete. Names were jotted down, but there were no photographs, no next of kin, no forwarding addresses for those who had supposedly left. It was a record designed to forget, not to remember. "Do you recognize any of these names?" Miles asked, pointing to a list of 13 women who had registered for short stays between March and October of the previous year, 2007. The time frame forensics had suggested for the murders. The abbot squinted at the list, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Some names are familiar, yes, but they left. One went back to her family in Ohio, another decided to travel to India. They found their peace and moved on. None of them, to my knowledge, disappeared suddenly." His answers were too smooth, too practiced. There was no flicker of panic, no genuine confusion. Just a placid, unnerving calm. Miles and his team interviewed the other residents. A quiet monk named Brother Michael, his eyes constantly downcast. 2 young nuns named Sister Claire and Sister Annabelle. They were all evasive, their faces blank masks of denial. They claimed to know nothing of any strange events, nothing of any missing women. But Miles saw the flicker of fear in Sister Claire's eyes when he asked her about a specific nun she had been seen with at the town market. I don't remember," she stammered, her gaze darting towards the abbot who stood silently in the doorway. "She said she was going home." Her hesitation was a crack in the wall of silence, a tiny fissure that Miles knew he would have to break wide open. The police began to dig not just into the earth, but into the history of the sanctuary and the lives of the women who had passed through its gates. They cross-referenced the names in the ledger with missing persons reports from across the country. There were no official reports. These women were transient, disconnected from their families, the kind of people who could vanish without raising an alarm. They were vulnerable, they were perfect victims, but the villagers of Havenwood had longer memories than any official record. An old woman who ran a tea stall near the temple recalled several young nuns who used to stop by for conversation. "Nice girls," she said, but she hadn't seen any of them since late last year. They just stopped coming. The forensic reports began to paint a clearer, more horrifying picture. Some of the bodies had been in the ground for over 6 months. Others were only 3 or 4 months old. This wasn't a single explosive act of violence. This was a continuous, systematic process of murder, a slaughterhouse operating in slow motion. The search of the sanctuary itself began on the 14th of July. It was methodical, painstaking. Miles felt like an archaeologist of evil, sifting through the layers of a toxic civilization. In the temple's large, cool kitchen pantry, a small dark stain on a single floor tile caught his eye. It was almost invisible, scrubbed but not quite gone. He pointed. "Bag it. Test it." 3 days later, in a cluttered utility room near the back of the temple, a detective found a scrap of torn brown fabric snagged on a nail near an old, disused door. It had a few faded Chinese characters embroidered on it, a detail that seemed out of place in this westernized spiritual center. Near a dusty wall in the same room, another officer found a string of wooden prayer beads, the kind known as mala beads. They were dark with age or use, with a single distinctive Sanskrit character carved into the main guru bead. The real breakthrough came on the 26th of July. Miles, acting on a hunch, directed a search of the attic rooms, spaces the abbot had claimed were used only for storage. In a small, forgotten room at the end of a dark corridor, tucked under the eaves, they found it. A heavy, locked wooden chest, covered in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a generation. They pried it open. The hinges shrieked in protest. Inside, among a jumble of old scriptures and ceremonial objects, was a brown robe. It had been shortened, crudely hemmed, and it was stained. There were dark, ugly patches spattered across the front, stains that had soaked deep into the coarse fabric. The abbot, when confronted with the chest, denied any knowledge of it. "It must have been here for years," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "From the previous owners, perhaps." But forensics don't lie. The lab report came back 2 days later. The stains on the tile in the pantry were human blood, too degraded to get a DNA profile, but the message was clear. The stains on the robe from the attic chest were also human blood, and from these they got a match. The DNA belonged to one of the skeletons unearthed from the mass grave, a young woman from Zhuan province in China, a detail confirmed by the characters on the other scrap of fabric. A nun who had, according to the abbot's own ledger, registered for a short stay in mid-2007 and then supposedly gone home. The murder weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. The murder weapon was the sanctuary itself. The attic room was now a confirmed crime scene. Underneath a set of loose floorboards in an adjacent attic room, they found something else. A small cloth bundle, hidden away like a desperate secret. Inside was a comb, a small, intricately carved pouch of beads, and a folded, crumpled note. The handwriting was almost illegible, blurred by what could have been tears. But 2 words were clear: home and escape. It was the last will and testament of someone who knew they were trapped, someone who had tried to flee and failed. The wall of silence at the sanctuary was beginning to crumble. The fear of the police was slowly starting to outweigh the fear of the abbot. On the 15th of July, even before the discovery of the chest, a young nun named Sister Annabelle had approached Miles's partner, her hands trembling. She spoke in a whisper, her eyes wide with terror. She said that 2 months ago she had heard crying from one of the old storage rooms at night. A woman's weeping, muffled and desperate. The next day, one of the other nuns was gone. Her clothes, her meager possessions, everything had vanished. When Annabelle asked about it, she was told sternly not to speak of it again. The girl had simply gone home. Now, on the 28th of July, they brought Sister Annabelle to the station and showed her a photograph of the torn robe found in the attic. She confirmed seeing it there. She said the abbot had found her near the room once and had told her never to touch the chest, that it contained sacred objects that were not her concern, a direct contradiction of his earlier denial. That same day, they brought in Sister Claire again. Faced with Annabelle's testimony and the forensic evidence, she broke down. Sobbing, she confessed that she had suspected for months that someone was being held captive in the old rooms. She had heard pleading cries at night. She had seen the abbot locking the doors to that section of the sanctuary, something he had never done before. When she voiced her concerns, the abbot had dismissed them calmly. It was the wind, he said, or perhaps troubled outsiders who sometimes wandered onto the grounds. She had been too scared to question him further. She had chosen to believe the lie because the truth was too monstrous to contemplate. The trickle of information became a flood. A local man named Jedediah Stone, a grizzled hunter who lived on the edge of the forest, came forward. He said that back in May of the previous year, he'd been tracking a deer near the temple grounds late one evening. He saw a figure in a brown robe dragging a woman into a back room of the sanctuary. The woman was struggling, her feet kicking feebly. He hadn't reported it. "You don't mess with the abbot," he'd grumbled. "Figured it was none of my business." He specified that the person dragging the woman was thin and had grayish hair, a description that fit both Abbot Thomas and the quiet, stooped monk, Brother Michael. A phone call to a hotline set up by the police brought more. It was a man from back east. He said his sister, a nun from their home province in China, had been staying at the sanctuary. In July of 2007, she had called him, her voice tight with fear. She'd said things were not good at the temple, that the abbot was not the man he appeared to be, and that she wanted to leave, to come home. It was the last time he ever spoke to her. Her name matched one in the ledger, and her DNA matched one of the bodies. Frank Miller, the man who delivered firewood to the temple, recounted a strange memory from last September. He'd been making a late delivery and saw a flickering light like a lantern in the back courtyard of the temple near where the bodies were found. He'd caught a glimpse of an elderly person in robes standing next to another nun who was slumped on the ground, unmoving. He thought it was strange, but he had dismissed it. He linked the elderly figure to either the abbot or Brother Michael. More monks came forward. One, who had left the temple in early 2008, contacted the police. He revealed that in November 2007, he had overheard Brother Michael threatening another monk, telling him to keep his mouth shut about the crying they'd heard at night. The suspicion, which had focused solely on the abbot, now widened to include his quiet, unassuming accomplice. The evidence was overwhelming. On the 5th of August, 2008, Detective Miles Corrigan walked up the stone steps of the sanctuary one last time. He didn't come for tea. He came with arrest warrants. Abbot Thomas and Brother Michael were taken into custody. The abbot maintained his serene, pious facade, even as the handcuffs clicked shut around his thin wrists. The final piece of the puzzle, the move that would shatter the last vestiges of their denial, was a piece of strategic brilliance on Miles's part. He put the abbot and Brother Michael in a single interrogation room together, a room he told them was unmonitored. He left them alone, with a single hidden camera rolling. For an hour they sat in silence. Then Brother Michael, his composure finally cracking, began to speak. "I can't take the blame for you, Thomas," he whispered, his voice hoarse with panic. "I can't. You dragged them into the storage room. You did it. I didn't actively participate. I just helped." "Silence," the abbot hissed, his voice losing its gentle quality for the first time, replaced by a cold, reptilian venom. "You will say nothing. They have no proof of who did what." But they did. They had it all on tape. Their shared conspiracy, the abbot's role as the mastermind, laid bare by their own panicked words. It was the nail in their coffins. On the night of August 12th, in a cold, sterile interrogation room, the mask of Abbot Thomas finally fell away completely. There was no more piety, no more compassion. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. He confessed. He told them that in 2007, the sanctuary had faced financial difficulties. Donations were down. Few new practitioners were coming to stay. He began to develop, in his words, desires. A greedy, covetous hunger for the young, vulnerable women who came to him seeking salvation. He was their guide, their spiritual father. They trusted him, and he exploited that trust, using his position of absolute authority to satisfy his depraved urges. And when they resisted, when they threatened to leave, to expose him for the monster he was, his fear of his reputation being destroyed, of losing the prestige and power he had so carefully cultivated, became his primary motive. He couldn't let them leave. He couldn't let them speak, so he killed them. He told Miles he couldn't stop himself. He would lure them to the secluded back rooms. He would use his bare hands, choking them, suffocating them, sometimes pinning them against the cold stone walls, using wet cloths to muffle their screams. He claimed the first one was an accident, that he'd grabbed her neck too tightly in a moment of panic, but the 13 bodies in the woods told a different story. It was not panic. It was practice. After each murder, he would wrap the body in an old, discarded robe. Then, under the cover of darkness, he and Brother Michael would carry the dead weight out to the shared pit behind the temple. They would cover the bodies with soil, mud, and dry grass, a desperate attempt to conceal the ever-worsening smell. He had chosen the secluded area to avoid detection, turning the sacred ground of his sanctuary into his own personal cemetery. He had preyed upon the fact that many of the nuns had no close family nearby, no one to file a missing persons report. When others asked, he simply said they had gone home or gone to study elsewhere, demanding silence and obedience from his remaining terrified followers. Brother Michael, for his part, admitted to his role. He was the assistant, the collaborator. He confessed to helping bury at least 4 of the victims. He helped supervise the silence. He helped dispose of the bodies. He was the janitor for a serial killer. The sentences came swiftly. Based on the overwhelming evidence and their own damning confessions, Abbot Thomas was sentenced to death for serial murder, sexual abuse, and the systematic concealment of his crimes. Brother Michael received a life sentence for his role as an accomplice. On August 24, 2008, just over a month after the first body was discovered, Abbot Thomas was executed by lethal injection. He reportedly met his end with the same placid, unnerving calm with which he had lived his lie. The sanctuary of the White Cloud was sealed indefinitely, its doors locked, its wind chimes silenced. The remaining nuns were relocated, their faith shattered, their lives forever scarred by the knowledge of the evil they had lived alongside. The town of Havenwood was left in a state of shock, the beacon on their hill extinguished, replaced by a dark and terrible stain. Miles Corrigan stood on that hill one last time, looking down at the shuttered temple. The case was a grim lesson in the nature of silence, a testament to how evil can flourish when good people are too afraid to speak. He thought of the 13 young women, their names now just grim statistics in a case file. They had come to this place seeking peace, seeking light, seeking salvation, and instead they had found a monster hiding behind the mask of a holy man, in a sanctuary that was, in truth, nothing but a tomb. The Oregon air, once heavy with the promise of serenity, now felt heavy with the ghosts of the lost.